Welcome to SIIMCast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging Informatics and Medicine.
Greetings, SIIMCast listeners. In this episode, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Les Folio. Dr. Les Folio is a senior member in diagnostic imaging and interventional radiology at Moffitt Cancer Center. He's a senior member in the Department of Machine Learning at Moffitt Cancer Center and Research Institute, also a professor in the Department of Oncologic Sciences at the University of South Florida, Morsani College of Medicine. Some roles included managing Radiologist Champion Work Group and acting ACMIO of Imaging Informatics in 2023. Dr. Folio has over 30 years of informatics experience. Currently, he is on the board of directors of the Society of Imaging Informatics and Medicine, SIIM, and also on the Journal of Imaging Informatics in Medicine, JIM, editorial board, and board liaison on the SIIM Hackathon Committee, where he was a prior co-chair of the Hackathon Committee. It's always a pleasure sitting down with Dr. Folio and chatting with him, so I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. Hello, SIIMCast listeners. I can't think of a better way of spending my Friday afternoon than sitting here and chatting with Dr. Les Folio. He's a longtime friend, someone I always enjoy listening to, and he is here today to tell us about his informatics journey. Les, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mohannad. Wow, this SIIMCast certainly made me think back to the beginning, more than most may think. For example, my birth in an army hospital in Germany, where the power went out while my mom was in labor. And looking through my informatics eyes, I see that first experience as my first preparation, not mine, my father's actually, because he was the civil engineer in charge of the base. The lights went out. She's in labor. He goes across and gets his engineering buddies to wire the building next to the hospital and bring him across the street. So that was my first experience with preparation for downtime procedures, though I didn't have much part of it except for I was the start. But this episode was pretty easy for me to prepare for, perhaps because it's my favorite subject, me. All kidding aside, I meant informatics, essentially my sixth medical specialty. Other specialties I trained in or board certified in occupational and preventive medicine, aerospace medicine, trauma imaging that I had just based on deployments to Iraq and other places. And my favorites are radiology, imaging, and clinical informatics. And I'll talk more about that later. We have a publication coming up on the differences between imaging and clinical informatics. I also thought back to when my mom told me I had created a solution for a need that I had realized as she was going back and forth through a swinging door from the kitchen to the dining room, and she had wanted a doorstop. She told me I was like 3 or 4 years old. I don't remember it. I had to actually look up in ChatGPT how to make a swinging door have a doorstop on both the open end towards the kitchen and the open end towards the dining room, because I saw when she was cleaning, she would like jam something in there. Apparently I said, Mom, I can fix that with a rope and a couple knots. And there it was. I still don't know how I did it, but I think that's just an indication that I was an inventive kind of person. My father being an engineer and with the Army, he had me submit some things by the time I was 6 or 7 to what they called a Form 1000, what the Air Force calls the Air Force Idea Program, which I had 20 or 30 of. And you get paid for these types of things. The one I did at the time for whatever it was my dad had me do for the Army, I can't remember, it had to do with a pen or something. And as I went through school and life in general, my inner inventive mind never really rested. Sometimes I call it a gift. My wife calls it a curse because I'm often waking her up at 4 or 5 in the morning. And that's where I've written most of my books. Between 4 and 7 in the morning, all my books, I got 5 or 6 published books and about 150 publications, mostly written, or the ideas came from those times in my sleep. There's people who talk about those magic hours, but also thinking back to my parents, my mom was always organizing photographs and negatives. She would put them up on a board and look at the negatives. I'm like, what's that? And how's that work? And by 4th grade, I had my own darkroom and I was interested in the negative process. I was experimenting, especially since my darkroom was in the shared bathroom with my sister. And very often someone would open the door, the lights would go on. And there I rediscovered, it was science that even radiographers know. We used to do with x-rays where you solarize the x-ray or solarize a print in the development process. The light areas become darker from the light exposed, mistakenly or purposely. And the dark areas where the silver halide is collected then block some of that light. It almost makes it like a reverse with kind of a neat appearance. Solarization, then thinking to where that applies to radiography is there's like a digital solarization process that is now in most portable machines where it's line and tube visualization software that enhances the image in such a way that is at the root. It's within the portable during the source, and it's not something you do in your packs. And so that's something that has benefited a lot of centers looking for lines that you can increase the conspicuity by what I call a digital solarization. But these kind of things, experimenting with photography. And I'm going to make a couple quotes here. This one makes me think of Edwin Land. I actually worked with the competitor of Polaroid, Kodak, that's still around, and others that followed, leading into things like interactive multimedia reporting. But one of my favorite quotes by Edwin Land was, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing in excess. And this is what he did when his daughter said, why do we have to take the picture we just took in this field, go to the drugstore, get it developed, and we'd see it like a week later. And he, at that point, said he was going to invent the one-step camera, the Polaroid, Edwin Land. And I'll mention a couple of other quotes from him and maybe some others, but I was doing the color to photography by the time I was in 8th grade. I was doing newspaper work a little. I was delivering newspapers at 14 because that was the steady job that brought in 3 cents a paper. But occasionally I would do freelance photography, fashion shows, these kind of things. And by the time I was a senior, one of the teachers came to me and said, Les, I think you could figure this out. You do all kinds of things with astrophotography. I was taking pictures through telescopes. And he said, I need some high quality macro photographs of fly time. I'm like, okay, the macro photographs I kind of get, but what is fly time? And it's this art that I learned that fishermen that do, I forget what it's called, but they tie flies when they're out trout fishing and they're whipping this yarn around. But anyway, it was small work. And then I said, well, I've heard from my photographer buddies, and there was another photographer that's what he does to this day, David Campley from my high school, is still doing photography. He said, Les, if you just take your 50 millimeter lens on your SLR and just flip it around, it'll turn it into a 10x macro. So I duct taped it on there and took pictures, and it ended up in a magazine. That kind of stuff excited me, kind of innovating. So, and then in the high school rocket club, they came to me, hey, Les, we got this new thing where it's called Camrock, and you put it on the nose cone of the rocket. There's ST's rockets in high school, which a lot of folks use. We turned our son onto it when he was a kid. And the camera would go off when it's at its apogee, and the nose cone would then point down, the parachute would pull on it, snap the picture. And then I said, okay, well, I'll load it with the negative. I'll take that negative to my darkroom. I lived near the high school, and I'd have that thing developed with a Google Earth-like photograph in the 70s. And so that was kind of cool. And what's interesting, my son Lucas is now in the Rocket Club as one of the executives, and they compete at NASA and these kind of things at USF. And he's doing photography and all kinds of level 2 rocketry. I don't know what that means, but it sounds really cool. I also was turned on to breadboards. From my dad was an engineer. He was a civil engineer, mechanical engineer, but they weren't breadboards at the time. There were more of these boards that had springs on them, and you hooked your diodes and your Wheatstone bridge and your batteries, and learned a little bit about circuits. So I did the same to Lucas when he was in grade school. And he got to understand a little bit about logic and how the gates work. He was also learning coding at the time, so he surpassed me in all that. And that's the thing about mentees in general. But back to high school for me, a couple things that were big. I was kind of adventurous. I was into radios. I had an antenna I was building in the garage, and one day my mom was like a little frustrated because the antenna took up the entire garage. Neither car could be parked in there. It was a huge ground plane antenna for 28 megahertz citizens band radio. I wanted it on the chimney, but she said, no, it's going to make our house look funny with this big antenna on the house. And then one day it wasn't there, and she said, oh, did you throw away that big antenna project you were doing? I said, no, Mom, I tucked it up in the attic. Don't worry, it won't bother you anymore. But I'd actually hooked it up. My dad goes up there one day and he said, there's a coaxial cable coming through the ceiling into the antenna. And she said, what's a coaxial cable? All right, well, he's using it. He's using the antenna in the garage, and there's all this insulation. He said, I don't want him to start a fire. So I said, well, how about if I just put it on the chimney where I first wanted it? And there it sat for the remainder of. So there were my early negotiation skills, stepped it up. But speaking of burns, I volunteered for the fire company because I just was kind of bored with school. And plus you got out of school early if there was a fire in our East Whiteland Township, which was a small area on the main line. The reason I mention this is I get burnt in a fire. My mom visits me in the hospital. I thought you were in school. I said, well, I get called out of school when there's a fire. All the 5 volunteer firemen would be running out of the school because the alarm would go off. This might be old fashioned, but it was a volunteer fire company. They used all the help they can get. And plus, I wasn't learning anything in the classes that I remember, but I got out there in the real world after I got burnt. And she said, well, I don't think you should do fire department anymore. And he said, well, they pointed out this ambulance, nice new shiny ambulance they got. And I'd already driven a hearse, so I won't even get into that, but I was pretty good at driving it and backing up. And so I drove an ambulance, and here's where it hit me. Photography, and I was in the radios. I took a patient on emergency transport out of Malvern Fire Company. They had some ambulances there. Drove to somewhere in Bryn Mawr or somewhere in Philly, and they had this new thing in 1977 called a CT scanner. So I saw that CT scanner. I went where they're doing the CT, and I'm getting goosebumps right now because that's what I did I'm still doing it today. Did it for 12 years, and then I wrote my paper in senior high school. It's the only really interesting academic thing I did in high school was write a paper on CT and radiation protection, and that's what I did at NIH for 12 years. But when it came to distance chasing and antennas, I finally got into amateur radio. I raised the highest level there. My son is interested in that. He takes my signal-defined radio, which is essentially a skeuomorph, which makes a computer look like the actual dials. That's actually a test question in the clinical informatics, what skeuomorphs do as far as how a computer can look like the real thing. He was turned on to that, starts hooking it up. Even last week, he was getting some satellites. He said, look, I can download these satellite images from a computer with an antenna. And I said, okay, I didn't know what he was doing, but it sounded great, and he wasn't transmitting to him, so good on him. Now, speaking of Lucas, he went to USF. He got accepted there. We're driving him around campus in Florida. I'm at NIH. I was 62, so I got this email that I could retire again. I already retired from the military. And next thing you know, we're driving around campus, and my wife, Yuta, is in the front seat saying, hey, that's Moffitt Cancer Center. She looked to the side, and I'm in the back seat looking around. I look up. I see Marilyn Bowie, who I'd known for 10 years. I knew the boss. I called them up. And 4 months later, after 20 interviews, there I was at Moffitt Cancer Center, retired from NIH. It all worked out. But now getting back to the CT scanner photography and radios. So my guidance counselor, who I knew pretty well because I knew her son, I was in class with her son, who's now lead engineer for Cerner or Oracle to this day. So he got me into computers. But the guidance counselor, Lois Fritsch, his mom, said, Les, I see you here. You want to join the circuits, because I was into gymnastics and I was just full of energy and just didn't want to sit around in some college. So it was the Ringling College, which is now the only college, one of the few colleges in the nation that actually have augmented and virtual reality as a major, which is interesting because that's research I'm doing now with several centers, including Portugal with Chow. And VA centers are getting into this, where the augmented reality is something that can help surgeons. And this kind of Ringling school looks at it more for applications. And I think Moffitt is actually partnering with them on virtual reality and radiation therapy and these kind of things. So it's kind of like a full circle. I meant to say that in a way. But what's interesting is I didn't join the circus, but I did join the Air Force, which I'll talk about. And that was kind of a circus. For example, I'm in Germany and I met my wife, Yuta, in a TQM course, Total Quality Management, where we learned about Lean Six Sigma and these kind of things, Plan, Do, Study, Act, same kind of stuff we do today. But then I asked her right away if she wanted to fly with me to Spain. We had an empty seat in the airplane. A Piper Aero Spanish pilot was flying to Saragossa. And I said, hey, I'll be your co-pilot, be your pilot in command on the way back. And so anyway, we landed at San Sebastian. And this was, again, our first date. We're in the soup, we call it, or minimums. We're landing at this airport in Spain. And the air traffic controller guided us. We had a faxed approach plate, got in through minimums, landed just safely, no problems. Got up into the tower to thank the air traffic controller in this small airport in a small town, San Sebastian, Spain, just north of the Pyrenees. And fortunately, the wine bottle, it half finished, I guess, while, saying, whoa, this guy's trying to instrument approach in this weather. But he had some left, so we helped him finish the bottle of wine. But anyway, the old days. But while stationed in Germany.
I have to say, you're leaving me a lot of breadcrumbs of things that we need to follow up on, right?
Yeah.
So this wine bottle, we have to talk about this in more detail soon. You also said something about driving a hearse. We're going to have to find out about that at some point. But go on. I just wanted to say that I'm tracking these things.
Oh, I didn't think you were listening that well, but thank you. And some I'll talk more about than others. But yeah, and so while in Germany, I was turned on to, in fact, as soon as I got there as a radiologist, they said, we don't have any transcriptionists, but we're piloting this new Kurzweil voice activation thing to allow radiologists to dictate in it and have the words print out. This is in 1991. And so you can imagine with my voice profiles being saved on 5 floppies, how difficult that could be to be saying words in such a way that a machine can understand you back in those days. So, but I like being on the leading edge of these types of things, and I accepted it and learned it, and I'm pretty excited that it happened and it worked, and we see where it is today. In fact, with ambient reporting, what we call hyponym reporting, I do that every day. I'm depending on hyponym relationships to hypernyms. One of the vendors calls it ambient reporting, and it's starting to get pretty widespread, where you just kind of talk freely and it structures your report. And we're also working with large language models to then not only structure it further the way it should be, but also to cut a 1,000-word report into 300-word reports. So that's possible today. We demonstrated that last year at NIH. But soon after we met in Germany, I told her about this Air Force phone call I would get about my next assignment. And it would either be AFIP, Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, to teach there, which I ended up doing later for Uniformed Services University. But the other one was Osan, Korea. And I answered the phone and I said Osan, and she looked, and we weren't married at the time. She said, well, let's figure it out. I had the option to even leave the Air Force. I just signed up because it was so fun. And plus, I had this opportunity to start up the first teleradiology in the Air Force in the Pacific to connect all the medical centers in Korea, Osan Air Base to Seoul, 121 Hospital, but also to Busan and other places, and then eventually Alaska and Hawaii, and then Madigan. So, and then Elliot Siegel at the same time was doing this before me with the first digitized department, Baltimore VA, University of Maryland, I think both of them. So another pioneer there and mentor for me. And actually my son worked for Elliot Siegel's son with RadSite, which is interesting, back when he was younger. One thing about pioneering efforts was in Alaska, I was a medical student. I'm kind of going back and forth in the timeline, but in Alaska, I was in my second rotation. I went to a medical school that afforded us a lot of rotations in native medical centers. I went to South Dakota on a reservation there, went to Anchorage, Alaska, did orthopedics. A year later, went to Northern Alaska, and I went to Kaktovik, to a village that hadn't seen a doctor in 2 years. They said, do physical exams on all of them, get them updated on this and that. There weren't that many, did it in a couple of days. But one local native, a whale hunter, which is a big profession on the Arctic coast in the very northern area of Alaska, the Alaska Whaling Commission has them follow all the rules with all canoes and everything else they use. Is all manual, the gunpowder and the harpoons and all that. But he'd hurt his hand with a harpoon that got stuck in a whale, was still holding onto it. It was obviously a fracture. There was no x-ray machine. So being a photographer and was already an x-ray tech, because I did go through that school and then went to medical school, but I called the local photographer, developed the little bite wing x-rays on the dental x-ray machine in developer and fixer. I bypassed stop path, but I got enough of an image. I said, I think that's a Bennett's fracture. And I got on the, I think it was an amateur radio type thing, video, double hop, bouncing off ionospheric waves with high frequency. Got the image to Anchorage Medical Center orthopedic surgeon. They said, okay, Les, first of all, that's a Bennett's fracture. You're right. He has to come down here for a K-wire. It's a surgery. They otherwise would not have sent somebody with a thumb injury that distance, but the x-ray going to the orthopedic surgeon's eyes and saying that is an interarticular Bennett's fracture, it has to be fixed by surgery, otherwise he'll not have use of that thumb. So then that got the approval for the money and the time for them to fly all the way back to Barrow, Alaska, the very northern tip where we were centered out of, and all the way down to Anchorage. And that was essentially a pioneering of Alaska's telehealth program. The surgeon said, this is amazing, we should be doing this all the time, and Alaska depends very much on this. I also went to not just South America and did some rotations there, but Antarctica, the South Pole. Didn't do much telehealth there then because the 28K modem wasn't quite up to speed, but there is now a lot of experience in these remote areas. After my tour in Osan Air Base, the Air Force said, well, thanks for volunteering for that. We're going to give you what you've been asking for is your flight surgeon wing. So they sent me to the flight surgeon school, and that is a circus. It's pretty much where I got my occupational and preventive medicine, my aerospace medicine. I was already a pilot. I was a commercial pilot. I learned to fly in high school since I wasn't really paying attention to other classes. Actually, in Osan, I got a letter from NASA saying I was an astronaut nominee for the Air Force. That was interesting because I had applied through the Air Force. Then the Air Force selected me. Didn't tell me. That just goes through NASA. Maybe we weren't getting our mail in Korea. But she said, this letter's from NASA. You're now a nominee, which means that I am selected by the Air Force to compete with civilians in the Navy and others. They didn't select any that year. But anyway, plan B is not too bad. It's working out. Then they sent me for another master's degrees. I already had one master's in radiology for creating one of the first holograms out of MRI, which is in a couple of museums. MIT Museum has one of them, I think. And then I did the RAM, the residency in aerospace medicine. I got a master's of public health at Berkeley. And my thesis there was on putting a camera and a microphone on a computer to allow for audio-visual telephony in the event of a potential outbreak in distant places. This was in 1999, about 10 years before Zoom and Teams and all these things. That felt pretty good, but even Berkeley was looking at me a little differently. But going back to Edwin Land, another quote is that a significant invention must be startling, unexpected, and it must come to a world that is not prepared for it. Like my work in holography back in the 80s, I think on a Cray computer, we ran one at University of Penn, at Children's Hospital of Penn, one of the first holograms of a child's brain. It was on display at Franklin Institute and is now housed also in the National Museum of Health and Medicine, which the AFIP Museum, now moved to Silver Spring, just north of DC, also houses the blast test dummies, a term I coined when we were in Iraq, getting a lot of sniper shots and blast injuries. Actually wrote a book on it. Combat radiology actually coined that term as well. But the blast test dummies, which the Army calls them now, we would shoot these dummies in different angles because I was convinced with having the first multi-detector CT in Balad, Iraq, and other radiologists were noticing it too. It's like we could tell exactly where these bullets go through. Plus, we have RFID in the Marco Polo program, radio frequency ID, on the active duty folks that we could see their location. So we saw their location. We had all kinds of accelerometers and saw the gunshot, and we could review. And so we were actually ended up on Discovery Channel. They called me one day and said, I had a publication in radiology on how we would shoot these blast test dummies with Secret Service, actually, that partnered with them, to then determine that we could see between the 4th floor where the friendlies were and the 7th floor rooftop where the bad guys would shoot from. And we could tell it was the bad guys. And that's very important to the most important 3-letter agency, not the CIA or OSI or these kind of things, but the MOM. Parents wanted to know, was it friendly fire from their squadron? Because they would deploy SEALs and Marines and whoever, they would deploy together. And if it's a friendly fire potential, they spend many, many years investigating these things. We're still looking at Vietnam head injuries, for example. They'll never stop being studied, right? And you never want to, because there's so much to be known by this. But we did show that you could tell within 5 degrees through multiplanar reformation where a shot came from relative to the body, and knowing where the body is, then you can pinpoint those locations. And I was always kind of a process person too. I strive for efficiency. My mom said it was because I was lazy at heart, and I would spend extensive energy into making something easier, like you see in some of these shows, where the coffee maker turns on the toaster. And I didn't go that wild. But when I was in Iraq and we were realizing we're writing a lot of the stuff down, and I'd worked at the Pentagon. I was at the Pentagon doing science and technology. So I was all about informatics and the computer and leveraging what computers can do for us, informatics, clinical informatics. But they see me writing it down, visitors from my Pentagon and others. But Les, you're like an informatics guy, and you're sitting here writing these things down. But we were doing it in a manner that air traffic controllers use to move airplanes throughout the world. It will always be there because you cannot have a computer. You don't have patience to have a Control-Alt-Delete while an airplane is in the air and 2 airplanes are about to hit. So there is no control alt delete. Is it a physical process? We did it in that kind of manner. I came back, I gave my lecture. I taught thousands of medical students at the Uniformed Services University, the military medical school. And I present what we were doing. And there's an air traffic controller in the class. There are 100 active duty military folks that decided to go to medical school. One was a C-17 pilot. He was going to be a pilot physician. And they came up to me after my talk and I showed how we were moving these patients like air traffic control. And they said, sir, because I was a teacher and ranking, we think there's something to this. And we studied it at the Bushmaster in Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. The people there were laughing at first because we had this air traffic control board trying to triage 30 casualties, some of them fictitiously dead, in the exercise. And it worked so overwhelmingly well that they continued to train that way from that point on. They made units out of it. A company made this board. It's an air traffic control unit. It comes up and you move patients like you move airplanes, because patients run out of blood when they're shot and blown up, and airplanes run out of gas just because they will. So same process. It worked. We tried it at Baltimore Shock Trauma, had a publication there, had a publication with others with experience in Iraq. And so it's very rewarding to see these types of things. Now let's jump to South America. I was in Bolivia for a preventive medicine rotation. And I forgot about this, but I mentioned Marilyn Bowie, and we have worked together on some things like patient portals. But we were treating parasites and tropical medicine diseases on the Rio Mamoré with the Bolivian Navy, which they have a Navy because they have a large river. They don't have a coast, but the US Navy worked with the Bolivian Navy. We would train the military in the preventive infectious disease. That was in my preventive medicine residency, where we saw a patient brought to us by a dugout canoe. She looked like she was just ready to die. They knew something was going on. They moved her from the dugout canoe to our hospital ship. We had thousands of patients waiting in line because the boat would just go up and down once a year. But we thought it might be strongyloides. We got a sample from the stool. We put it on the microscope, and somebody had a digital camera. And they said, this worm is swimming just like they taught us. The strongyloides has this turn where it coils and uncoils. Characteristic, which I learned in the class, but then saw this patient who was about ready to die. We treated her, by the way, and she lived thanks to ivermectin. And seeing this, you treat them with the disease, and it's life-saving. What we did to make sure is we took that little video clip, with balancing the camera up to the microscope, similar to what I did in high school by taking the lens and reversing it and making a macro, just duct tape these things together. And we got a snippet. We sent it to Walter Reed, to the pathologist specialist there in tropical medicine disease. And he said, that's strongyloides. Boom, you're done, right? You send it, it's through a 28K modem. I don't even know where we found that. Even the Navy ship was knocking on my door in the middle of the night because I had an early Garmin back in the day. And they were like, we're lost. Can you tell us where we are? So lots of funny stories there. But so process, that's something that's more emphasized in clinical informatics. But in the meantime, I took the AHIC course, AMIA Health Informatics course, as a backup, since after my CIIP, Clinical Imaging Informatics Professional, I wanted to go a little further. So I got the AHIC, which AMIA calls an A-chip. So I've always been told I'm a chip off the old block. And I guess now I've got letters to show it. AMIA's certification in health informatics professional. So very exciting. I got to say though, Mohannad, talking to you here, one of my landmark inspirations that I'll never forget, and getting goosebumps thinking about it, is the SIM hackathon. I remember the first time I'm sitting in class, you're talking about Postman and API keys. And I'm like, I'm a little lost here. I'm like, I want to do something with interactive multimedia reporting. Everyone's like, okay, yeah, Les, sorry, but learn this stuff. So I finally got an API key, I think the next year, I just observed. And it was 2018 or 2019, I believe, where I presented again on interactive multimedia reporting. It was in Denver. I recall Alejandro Casablanca, and Arseny Oman, which we got by a trade with Terry Sipple-Smith, everyone's mentor for a hackathon. And in those two, and Michael Doe, my postdoc, and Marcus from Florida Atlantic University, within a few days, we created this thing we called Paxman. And I got to thank Thomas Sullivan. He wasn't on our team, but we were in touch. And Arseny said, hey, Tom, I think because you're doing Soulmates, which is a clever name for the soul events, that he allowed to show during the showcase. I get goosebumps again by thinking after we did our presentation, Arsene is showing how you can segment a gallbladder or you can paint the aorta. So people were trying it. And then Thomas Sullivan gets up afterwards. I couldn't have been better planned. And it was like something you thought for sure was going to break. I'm like, that's just not going to work. Even when Arsene and Alejandro said, we're going to do this live. I said, well, good luck. But if it breaks, that's fine. But when Tom got up there and explained how the Sullivans were pushing the folks' input of the judges and the audience were just frantically going and segmenting organs because they saw themselves on the leaderboard live. I'm still amazed to this day to that. And it's not me, it's the team. I just got such a thrill out of that. When your mentees exceed your own expectations and surpass you, that's when it makes it all worthwhile. That's not Edwin Land, that's Les Folio. Maybe someone else said it.
Your relationship with the hackathon, I think, extended. It probably started a couple of years before, because I know first time I met you was in Pittsburgh around the hackathon. Mm-hmm. And hackathon with COVID pivoted to going virtual and it started issuing e-badges. And I couldn't help but notice, I'm looking at your LinkedIn profile, hackathon winner 2021, hackathon winner 2022, hackathon winner 2023.
I know I collected those. I was like, I just like being in the background of these as a mentor, but
what you said earlier of your mom joking about you being lazy, I think the flip side to that argument is that you're innovative. Because I feel like every time I talk to you, you're full of cool ideas that are really out of the box.
Yeah, I often say, what box? If there is no box.
I'm going to quote you on that one. I'm going to write it down. I'm quoting you on this one, Les.
Yeah, Google actually wanted it for one of their URLs, and I actually had the URL. I don't think they were going to go for it, though, because of negative potential consequences with that. But when we started talking about this, and you sent me an example, and it was David Kwan's and Kinson Ho about the interactive multimedia reporting. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. I remember when David and myself and Kinson were coining the term interactive multimedia reporting, the interaction of the report where you click on the link, the measurement takes you right to that image. I really miss that. We don't have it currently at Moffitt. We hope to get it soon with another vendor. Most vendors are going in that direction because it just makes so much sense. But where was I going with that? When he started off his SIIMCast, I'm listening and I'm like, oh, wow. And then he's talking about this guy he met at RSNA and saw this in action. And he said, oh, then I met Les Folio. I was just, wow. I thought about all of our presentations together at RSNA and other places, and the science of IMR, which used to be called multimedia something, it just was cumbersome. So during one of the 2 white papers that were published after, 3 years of success with developing that, we said, let's just make it interactive multimedia reporting. Then he talks on that SIIMCast. I refer you to that to talk about their successes with the IHE profile, which is maturing, and I'm hoping it'll go to ballot soon and just be a standard and see this everywhere.
I should point out that a friend of mine pointed to me that HTI-2, the government rule, is apparently, as it stands right now, this could change, actually has language about embedding hyperlinks in reports to images and things like that. So, your wish may not be that far off. It may actually become legislated.
That's great. And if it's something where CMS says this is what you got to do, it just makes so much more sense. I mean, at NIH, when we started that about 10 years ago, I just remember showing this to one of the oncologist summer retreats and seeing the oohs and ahs from the audience. You just remember some of these things. And I encourage folks that do a lot of experimenting and inventing to think about the good things you come up with, the things that really manifest. I've got something right now, an invention that I have a patent with NIH. I'm going to try to license it from them, even though I invented it. This is an excalometer that, I have a little disclaimer here because I invented it, but they own it. I don't make any money from it, but it's a ball that goes and swings in the marker. So on an ICU patient, you can tell within 10 degrees, we've shown at University of California, San Francisco and San Diego and a couple of VA hospitals that the marker works. You're within 10 degrees of what the patient's position is. Now, that's not a successful invention yet. People aren't using it. And that's partially my fault. I just need to barge some doors down and actually license it and do something with it. But I encourage people to think about the successes and not so much the failures, because there's a quote by Einstein, I forgot what it was, but if I think of it later, maybe we can post that in. But it's about learning by your mistakes. And if you learn by your mistakes, then I must be pretty smart. I'm just thinking back to phone calls. I would, because I was flying operational missions and kind of going back and forth here to make it interesting. But I was just looking at a couple conversations I've had with my wife where I call her up and I say, just to let you know that the good news is that we didn't crash. However, the red-tailed hawk that busted through the windshield in our Cobra attack helicopter that hit me in the shoulder, that I have a new one now, not only died on impact, the hawk died on impact, went through the head-up display unit, hit the pilot in the face, but we double shielded in California, low-level nap of the earth missions. I said, we're okay. I'm going to be a little bit late, but the hawk is so mangulated. The worst news is that we can't do a taxidermy on it. They said it was too mangulated and they couldn't build the bird. The National Guard wanted to have it where it was a monument with the hawk crashing through the windshield. I don't know, but I would call her again one time from Elmendorf Air Force Base. I said, just to let you know, if you hear on the news about an airplane crash, it wasn't me. We're in the plane behind them. So we're fine. But unfortunately, that crash in front of us, they all died.
You mentioned that you had your start in the Air Force.
Mhm.
When you joined the Air Force, did you already have in mind that you were going to go into medicine? And if not, how did you arrive at that decision? And then the next follow-up question is, what brought you into informatics? I can kind of see how that happened, given your background, but I want to hear the story from you.
Okay. I joined the Air Force. I was actually already a physician. I went from X-ray school to college, got a bachelor's in radiology, BSRT, knowing that I wanted to go to med school and be a radiologist. I wanted to go in the military, but I was advised that if you want to go in and have your specialty, radiology is very tough to get. Most don't get it. Informatics is very tough to get. We had one last year in the Air Force, actually working with him, Nathan Brumberger, who presented on clinical versus imaging informatics. We're going to publish a paper on that. In the next couple of months, it'll be published. But I elected to get into my radiology residency, got that, and then I called the Air Force. Okay, I got my residency. Now you pay me in the rest of my residency and then send me to a base of almost my choice. I clicked the little box saying overseas. So they sent all my stuff. They were going to send me to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, but that volcano went off. All my stuff got damaged in the volcano. But then they said, okay, we're sending you to Ramstein, Germany. So that's part of the circus. I joined the Air Force after I knew I was going to be a radiologist. And in the clinical informatics, I applied for fellowships throughout the Air Force, but couldn't get them. But I think the informatics thing came from some of the things I talked about with process, which is more clinical informatics, things like Lean Six Sigma and leadership in their curriculum. But then the informatics came about. It just was me. I was in medical school. I was immediately identified as the geek that could finally get their Medline up and running with a 28K modem and understand the command prompts. Actually, I call my friend Todd Fritch, with Oracle. His mom, being my guidance counselor, convinced me not to go to the circus. This is kind of strange when you think of it. But he would say, here's what you do. And we got the connection. And by second year med student, I started the educational program on what we call now decision support, computer order entry, CPOE. I was teaching this to medical students on floppy disks. We got our first computers. And I remember the first case scenario was strep viridans on someone that just recently had their tooth pulled and then they had a heart murmur. And the computer would just walk you through and prompt you. And I think at that point and doing 3D before its time, we used to run 3D CT throughout the night on tape drives back in the 1980s, getting my master's in holography, master's in radiology, creating the hologram, and then getting invited to the Pentagon after my teleradiology pioneering in Korea. We get another phone call. We're in California, living the good life, driving up to our cabin in Lake Tahoe on Route 80. And I get a phone call on these new things, cell phones now. And I said, oh, it's Steve Holt, the guy who was running the informatics at the Pentagon, science and technology. I said, let me pull over. So I pull over on the highway where there wasn't 8 feet of snow going to our cabin. And I have a piece of paper in between us on the console. And I'm talking to Steve. I wasn't on speakerphone. And he's like, okay, Les, we'd like to invite you to the Pentagon to do science and technology. Since you are already promoted to be a colonel, that's going to involve the colonel's board. It's going to be complicated. But because we need you to start telehealth in the Air Force, that's what it was. He said, we want to start telehealth in the Air Force. I forgot about this. Thanks for prompting me. And he said, there is no line item in the UTC, unit type code. There is no such position, but we're going to bring you in and you're going to be in charge of science and technology and blah, blah, blah. But in the background, we want you to create this. I deployed to Iraq. Sometimes on secret missions, I'd leave a little sticky note on my boss's desk who wasn't cleared for the same secrecy. Gone for a few months, off to Iraq. The sticky note fell off. He didn't even realize after a week I was gone. Guess that's how much of an impact I made there. But yeah, we did it. I was invited back to the Pentagon 2 years later, having forgotten about this. I got a $250,000 grant from Northern Taiga, a woman-owned Alaska company, to start telehealth companies like we did in Alaska back in the 80s. I got invited back to this big boardroom. They put me at the head of the table. And I said, I thought you were just going to kind of show me around. They said, Dr. Folio, everything you see on this floor, it was at actually an SAIC building or something. It's not even the Pentagon. It was a Skyline. I'm looking around, all these people, a few of them I knew, and they're all laughing at me. They're like, they said, we are all here because of you. You created telehealth. Here we are. And the program's still going strong. I mean, you've seen the growth of telehealth with COVID. And that was kind of some of the original things we were planning for. We were doing syndromic surveillance in the long time ago, where CHCS, which I was fortunate to use starting in the 1990s, pretty much a mumps-driven engine, which some medical records still run by, where we were sampling all CHCS hosts in the world. And if two people in two different locations ordered a chest x-ray for wide and mediastinum, it would flag in our office and say, we have a potential anthrax situation, before anyone even would think of that. But they won't think about it as individuals. This is the kind of the birth of syndromic surveillance. So that kind of answer your question on how I got into informatics. It just fell on me like you and the hackathon and SIM. I should have been involved in SIM years ago, but no regrets. Here I am. And I encourage people to just go with their dreams. And if they get burnt in a field fire, then drive the ambulance.
Better late than never, right? That's what they say.
I just stumbled onto augmented reality. With Zhao, I gave a talk on interactive multimedia reporting in Portugal. And Zhao, this augmented reality stuff you're doing is taken off. It's at the Champagne part of University of Lisbon, Portugal. I was amazed. And we're in touch. We're submitting. We're presenting in Pisa to USOMI on 3 different centers and how they're using augmented reality and microinvasive surgery. At Moffitt, we want to do it for sentinel nodes, microinvasive surgery. Tampa VA is already using augmented reality for thyroid biopsies. We're working on multimodality registration. Our machine learning department at Moffitt is looking into the registration, because that's one of the difficulties, not just image registration between a CT and an ultrasound or an MR, cross modality, but with the person as the person moves. And all your fiduciaries, the real ones, the virtual fiduciaries, patient moves, that all changes. So a whole nother fun world there. It reminds me of my hologram days. But there is no end to where this technology is going. And we just have to implore it and not look at it like competition. There are those radiologists and pathologists and other physicians that will fear AI. There are things we do need to be fearful of, but those that implore it and leverage it and understand it and keep the chains on it, which the FDA and RSNA will help us with. They won't allow the fully automated without the human in the loop. I did a study at NIH 2 years. I think we did human in the loop, where I had everybody from high school students to college students measuring the lesions in advance, not interpreting the CTs, but they would do this like our 3D lab. Everything was measured by the time it came to me. It cut our time in half as radiologists. We didn't have to measure anything. Everything hyperlinked to the bookmark table. All that was exported. For 2 years, we showed that it cuts radiologist time about in half, and the students that do it. And interestingly, it was more about folks with a gaming background, a computer background, rather than a medical. Once you trained them on the visual, I'm not trying to poo-poo everything we learned in radiology, but pattern recognition, yeah, they don't see everything. But the lesions were measured on the prior exam. They're already flagged as to where they should be in the new exam. It's the human in the loop augmented intelligence to the AI that assisted them. And 90% of the time, it showed them the lesions. And then by the time it came from us, everything was measured. And we would feed back to the students so they would learn. Then we had a leaderboard to show them where they compared with other students in a anonymous way. It's like, wow, I'm learning. over time. I like radiology. One of them just finished her fellowship at University of Penn in body fellowship, and now she's going, I forget where she's going after that, but one of them turned out to be a lawyer. The other one, Michael Doe, he is now at University of Texas. I have to actually get in touch with him to see, but yeah, we published, I think we did 2 publications. They were accepted like right off the bat. I'll close here saying that I've got video of some of the telehealth experience that's on YouTube. Maybe if it's not linked on the SIIM website, I can do a LinkedIn post or something and share some photographs of some of this and maybe some of the publications. And of course, I'll be available for any questions after this on some of these crazy things that I've mentioned.
Yes, crazy things is probably the best description, but it's been awesome listening to you, Les. We're definitely happy to add those links to the podcast when this goes out. But yeah, like you said, LinkedIn is another avenue. It's always a pleasure listening to you, Les. I wish we had more time to could talk about more of these things, but maybe that will be a reason for us to have you another day talk about some of these things. I'm still curious to hear that Hearst story, but again, we'll come back to this another day. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Okay, and thank you, Mohannad, for managing this, and Jason helped organize this so we could make it today. But yeah, thanks again, and thanks for all your mentorship.
SIIMCast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics and Medicine. Please visit our website at SIIM.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at sim_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.